when you talk about fear, it's deeply personal, right? It viscerally comes out in you in ways that are different than other people, and everyone's anxiety looks like a different prison. So for me personally, the idea of leaving the law was terrifying insofar as I didn't know where my money would come from. I didn't know what I would do next. There were a lot of specific things, but I had not felt like my identity was tied to being a lawyer in the way that I think a lot of people speak of it. And that's probably because I went to law school on a bed. The difference I see in some of the readers who write, or the lawyers who write me in fear of leaving, is partly that I was young enough that I hadn't a mortgage and a family and a deeply, ensconced life that would create a much bigger obstacle to leaving. And part of it is also that I never saw my life as being one thing. And I was brought up in a family that really focused on story. My mom, studied history and would tell us at the dinner table these like amazing stories about, King Henry VIII. She would just make it so interesting that I was brought up truly to focus on all the little details as being the building blocks of life, and that you can sort of weave together this tapestry of what life means to you from all these disparate nodes that maybe other people don't weave together. Like that's your thing. So I think it goes to identity more than anything. That fear for me came down to like the things I worried about myself, like getting really sick, getting hurt, something, getting, sexually assaulted, the very personal things that happened to me. But from an identity perspective, those were less of an issue because I felt like I have this skill set, I'm able to put those skills to use somehow. Somehow I got through law school. It's basically not out of my teens. Like I can figure that part out. And I think that confidence is what allowed me to do it.
This is episode 8 of the Ownstream podcast featuring Jodi Ettenberg.
All right, welcome to the Ownstream podcast. This is Stephen Shelley.
And this is Teresa Scoba.
And we have just hung up with Jodi Ettenberg. She was in Oaxaca, Mexico, where she currently lives. And what a great conversation. You're in for a real treat. She really is so thoughtful and intelligent and well-spoken about her path and her process and her life as a traveling, working, I guess we would call her a digital nomad, though I don't know how people who we would call digital nomads, if they want to be called digital nomads, but nevertheless.
I think she would.
She wouldn't mind. We first became aware of Jodi a number of years ago. I used to listen, I still do listen to the Tropical MBA podcast, and that's a really, really great podcast for those people who are digital nomads or who are location independent, entrepreneurs, people traveling, wanting to really have an in-depth discussion about the entrepreneurial lifestyle, traveling, and particularly in countries where there are a lot of people doing that, namely Thailand, Southeast Asia, Vietnam. We saw a lot of digital nomads in Chiang Mai, Thailand, for example. Anyway, so that's how I learned about her and was impressed with her story. She had started out, as you'll learn, she started out as a lawyer, actually having gone to law school in Canada, then came to New York, took a job, and like many people was just a little blindsided, I imagine, by how much work there was and how it wasn't exactly fulfilling, and took a sabbatical for a year and traveled. And so Teresa here, she'll talk in a second, also went to law school, didn't find herself at a law firm, but found herself in a similarly embroiling job where there was quite a lot of time and energy and tension and stress and just, the corporate lifestyle. And so when I first heard the podcast, I shared it with her as inspiration because one thing Jodi is really good at is writing, and Teresa's really good at that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I had a great job and I worked for a great organization, but I never, I talked about this on our intro podcast, like for many years wanted to do something more flexible with my time, and I had a lot of other interests kind of pulling at me for a long time, similar to Jodi actually, which I think is why Stephen, when he first found her, he said, hey, look at this woman who is a lawyer who left to travel around the world and write about food. I mean, basically like the things that make me the happiest are travel and food. and so she became this sort of symbol for me out there of somebody who could do that. And Stephen always said to me, I mean, I really enjoy writing. It's a huge part of my work. And I love writing on my own time and things I'm passionate about.
You're really good at it too.
And it's a strength of mine. And Stephen would always talk to me about, why don't you write a blog? And why don't you write about the things you're interested in? And, she's just proof of somebody who just, who started to do that. And then her life unfolded in this beautiful way. And I love how she talks on the podcast about storytelling. It's a passion of hers. It has been a passion of hers since her youth. It's how she engages with people. And it's something that she naturally unfolded in her writing on her website as she was creating her own story, I guess, which was what I think is so beautiful and has obviously connected and resonated so well with people because she's developed, before her eyes without even trying, quite a following.
Yeah, and she has used her interest in food as a marvelous kind of lens through which to explore the world, which is so simple but yet so elegant and vibrant. She talks at detail about the soups that she's loved and the spices and condiments that she's explored and street food and how she eats. Like she doesn't eat, in the West here we kind of consolidate all our food into 2 or 3 different highly packed meals, and she sort of eats at a very different pace, I think, much like how people in other countries live at a different pace. So she talks a great deal about that, and it's wonderful. And the thing that really shined through for me is how her business has just happened organically through her really putting her heart and soul in her writing and her photography as well, mainly food photography, I believe, and just really interesting things that have come up through her sharing valuable information with others. So just one quick example is, I guess this was in Vietnam or Laos, somewhere in Southeast Asia. She was writing a lot about the food, and people there said, "Hey, Jodi, if we paid you, would you feed us?" And so that led to her creating these really interesting food walks in these marvelous places in the world. I guess she's done a few in Oaxaca, where you stroll with her and she shows you really cool, tasty food items to enjoy that you might not find on your own. I guess she has a nose for that sort of thing. So
she's also, she's a real artist, and if you go to her site, you'll see these beautiful, what she calls food maps of countries she's gone to. She's creating 10 of them based on her readers' interests, and it just reminds me, I mean, she speaks very eloquently, the way she tells stories, but she has this really lyrical way about her, the way that she paints about food and talks about food, and that it's such a contrast from a desk job at a law firm, and she talks kind of about when she stepped out onto this journey, how it just became impossible to go back. Though she always, one way that she stays on it and feels safe and continuing is by just knowing that that's back there if she needs it, but she hasn't needed it.
And Jodi's she's been doing this for a few years now. I think her 9th anniversary, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Is coming up for her travels and her writing and all of this. And so she's really emerged as maybe, quote unquote, a leader in the digital nomad world. There aren't really any definite leaders, but she's got a little seniority. And so people look to her, I think, as a guide. And she speaks a lot. She's done a lot of public speaking, has really stared down that fear of hers, and has emerged as quite a good public speaker. Anyway, so you're going to enjoy this. Jodi's a marvelous guest. She's really very thoughtful and smart in her answers. We're excited to share this with you. We will be back afterwards to wrap up. Until then, enjoy this terrific interview with Jodi Ettenberg. We want to talk to you a lot about kind of your lifestyle and your business and kind of what motivates you or what fuels you. I think just maybe this is more of a selfish question from Teresa and I to start with.
Sure.
But you're in Mexico and we live in San Diego, and I don't know, and I think this is a predominant theme throughout the U.S., but Mexico is seen by many people here as this kind of scary place, and I'm curious, from somebody who's there, who's on the inside, knowing that it's a huge place and that there's lots of different nuances to the culture and the country. But from the inside of Mexico, what's it like there?
I think, with many places that you visit or live in, there are parts of them that are safe and, parts that are unsafe. And I think for Mexico, the reputation and what's portrayed in the media, as with, many places, is focusing on the negative and not the positive, especially with whatever political issues are being, put to the forefront in the States. Personally, walking around here, day or night, I feel safer than I do in many places in North America. Yeah. It's a very safe city, but there are, of course, parts of the country that are, run with cartels in mind and that are a lot less unsafe. The U.S. travel warnings update pretty frequently, and some of the states, like Guerrero, just to the north of here, is considerably more dangerous, but the mountains separate the two. So I think it depends where you go, the same way that some cities in the States are more dangerous than others. Oaxaca and other centers of, travel and food that are very popular, be it in the Yucatan or here in the South or even Mexico City, are a lot more safe than people realize.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think people who tend to be afraid of other places also aren't hopping on a plane to
haven't been to other places.
Yeah,
exactly. Haven't been to other places. Yes,
exactly.
But also here in the States, there's plenty of places to not necessarily go either. So yeah, go ahead, Teresa.
Well, and I think a lot of what we explore on this podcast is people who take different paths from the mainstream, and if there were fears or things that they heard, like, think for themselves and make choices, so maybe going in that thread, we were curious, reviewing your story and your website, you grew up in Montreal, living what seems like a pretty standard life, the way it's described, quote unquote normal.
I would say I was never normal, I will tell you that.
Okay, well, that's what we wanted to ask. So look at, with those outside normal activities,
sure.
Was there any inkling or, sense when you were younger that you were going to live a fairly unstandard life, actually?
I don't think I thought it that way, or I perceived that I would be abnormal. But I can tell you that my family was definitely like, yes, we knew this was going to happen. I went to law school because someone bet me I couldn't get in. I went to law school at 18. I never actually planned to be a lawyer, nor had any desire to be a lawyer. It just sort of happened because I applied straight from CEGEP, which is grade 12 and 13. And I got accepted. I was offered a scholarship, and tuition in Canada was, $1,600 as opposed to the many thousands of dollars. And this was at McGill, which is one of the best schools in the country. I think obviously that set me on a path that was different. I probably would have gone to do business school were I not in law school. But what happened was I ended up, being recruited to a firm in New York. And ever since I was younger, I'd seen a documentary about the Trans-Siberian trains, and I really wanted to travel and see them in person, and joked around about how while my friends bought like Louboutins, I was not buying shoes like that, but saving that money because it was a plane ticket somewhere far away. So I think, I never felt fully like I was subsumed within the New York experience, and always had, a reputation for organizing groups of people to do things on the weekends, or trying to, just see the little details in life that made it interesting. This is what my friends told me. They seemed less surprised than I did about the path I take. I'll say that. It's kind of interesting in retrospect. What surprised everyone is my interest in food, because I really never cared about food growing up. So much so, my mom, she likes to eat. She says, if I could take a pill and not eat, it'd be fine. Not from a body dysmorphia perspective, but because she's like always so energetic. She wants to be out and doing things like, can we go outside? Can we walk around? Let's eat so we can take a walk. And so food was sort of a necessity and not a pleasure growing up. And she didn't love to cook as a result. So it wasn't, I started cooking younger because she didn't like it, and I was offered to cook instead of clean, which was like a kid's dream come true.
Sure.
And it wasn't until I started traveling that I fell into the understanding of just how important food is to everyone else in the world. And I think the unconventionality of my life took form in a very organic way, the same way my business built itself, or I built it. And I think the same thing that applied to me going to law school when I did, or taking that job in New York applied, which is, you know, I've been someone who's always suffered from, dealt with, however you want to say it, been an anxious person. And I'm like, well, if I'm going to be anxious, I might as well be doing something interesting. And, you know, kind of tried to stay open despite the anxiety, despite the fear, to what would come my way, and what opportunities that I could maybe seize upon, because you just don't know what's behind the next corner until you take that first step to something different. So that was law school, then New York, and then the trip. And what was supposed to be a 1-year sabbatical, well, April 1st will be 9 years. So a lot longer.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to be sure to cover right now, since you brought up food. But you have your experience with celiac, and how that's a strong thread for you, and in your writing and your business, and obviously in your life.
Mm-hmm. I was diagnosed before it was sexy to be gluten-free. And I think it was a really big benefit, because it was great to know why I was so sick all the time, as growing up and, as a young adult, but also because I see people diagnosed these days and they want to sort of recreate the diets that they currently have, but with gluten-free food. And instead, it's great to see it as an opportunity to learn about food in different ways. My interest in food came in part because of that, because I had to learn about the building blocks of food to understand, while I was traveling, what would make me ill. And that, combined with seeing how important food was elsewhere, was the perfect storm. But I was diagnosed at a time where, there was no gluten-free bread, or bakeries or restaurants didn't understand it. People definitely took it more seriously then. Because there were no bandwagon gluten-free eaters that said they were celiac when they're not. And I have you can cut out whatever you want to be healthy. I don't eat much sugar. I'm very careful with what I eat. But there have been people who go to restaurants and say they're celiac, and then eat the brownie just because, or they don't react in the same way because there's no contamination issues. And it's really to the detriment of those of us who do have the disease. So I've tried to, be an advocate for people who get diagnosed and who aren't afraid to try and travel, or at least to encourage them, to travel, by writing guides. And I just launched translation cards that I'm charging, I think, $6.99 each for, where I deeply research the names of all the dishes and then get a translator to translate it and build a guide, because the existing cards weren't sufficiently covering things like cross-contamination and the local names. So it says I can't eat wheat, barley, and rye, but obviously people in a lot of places don't know what has those ingredients in it. So to really call out the ingredient names that are used locally has made a big difference. And for me, the disease is part of who I am. And like I joke, being a 5 foot tall, small woman traveling, this is the body I've been given, be it with my stomach or otherwise. And just trying to encourage people to travel if they have similar condition. I'm not saying the height is a condition, the similar celiac disease, but also just to hopefully teach people that even if they have the disease, or even if they don't, to learn about a place through food is a really magical way to bring in history and anthropology and all sorts of other domains that you don't really think about when you're walking around.
Right. Well, we'll come back to that, and I'll come back to those cards, because one thing that I'm really interested in about you and your website is, as you described earlier, the organic kind of natural way that things have happened for you there, because like your food drawings are really wonderful, and that sounds like a really amazing thing to offer. But I want to kind of put a bookmark on that. So talk about the film you watched when you were younger. I think it was a documentary or something about the lush garden spot of Siberia, and what appealed to you about this trip becoming kind of a source of excitement for you and travel.
Yeah, people are like, really, Siberia?
Right.
I mean, my experiences there were so interesting too. It's just such another world. I think it was a PBS. It's on YouTube. I actually linked to it in one of my posts. I think the post about quitting my job. I was like, wow, the quality is not how I remember.
Right.
It's just about building the trains and about the trains themselves. I don't know what otherworldliness brought me in as a kid or what was the fixation, but it became this, like, I really want to go there. The idea to me that, because I'm from Canada and, a lot of our country is also cold and snowy and hard to get to. And the idea that they would build this sprawling railway in the middle of a part of the country that's like so remote and rugged and unpassable was just, and linking villages that otherwise wouldn't be linked necessarily. Like, there are some really interesting articles about the doctors who ride the trains and get off at these villages who would never otherwise have access to a doctor. I think it was like the connectivity of the trains themselves. And, I just really wanted to go, and it turned into, well, let's do a year around the world. But the impetus initially was, I really want to ride those trains.
And what happened then from when you said you were going to just take a year around the world?
As in what happened with why I kept going?
Yes, exactly.
What is wrong with you, Jodi? A few things happened. First, I quit with another lawyer. That's why it's Legal Nomads, plural. Maybe I should have rebranded a while ago, but it's a little late now. She was my opposing counsel on a deal that I worked on. And we were like, we clicked at the closing dinner. And I was like, I don't know why. I think I had too much wine. I was like, I think I'm going to quit my job and travel the world. She's like, I've been thinking of doing that too. I was like, you should come with. She was like, I should come with. And we made plans to meet again, and we ended up quitting together. I ended up getting sick pretty early on, which is a recurring theme for an immunocompromised person. And she ended up continuing with the plans that we had. She ended up canceling the Trans-Siberian trains because for her, she was like, I just don't, this is your issue.
Right.
I went to India instead, which wasn't on my initial itinerary. I flew back to North America to get healthier, and then I went straight to Russia on a flight with a lot of vodka. And then I did the trains. And so I figured out a few things. One was that I didn't really know much about street food before I traveled, nor how cheap it was in Asia. So I found out that I really over budgeted for the first year. Mm-hmm. And I had enough to keep going. So the second thing is that I became obsessed with Asia. I remember as a kid, I asked for rice for breakfast. My mom was like, we don't do that. This is not what we eat for breakfast. And I got to Asia and I was like, Mom, like they do that here. Please, this is where I belong. And I really just loved it so much. And loved discovering through food, and everything fit me clothes-wise, and the people were so interested that I cared about their food that it led to these invitations to weddings and funerals and all these other sort of engaging ways to get to know a place better. And I started, I kept writing on the site. My former travel partner, she didn't love writing, and early on when I ended up like heading back to Russia, she wrote a few posts, but she was like, you just take over the site. She went back to be a lawyer at the end of that 1 year, like we were both supposed to. Although she also was like, there's no way you're going back. I was like, I'm totally going back. She's like, nah. End up like, this is going somewhere. I was like, no, I'm going to go be an in-house counsel at like one of my clients. And she's like, I don't know what I missed that everyone else didn't.
By the way, Jodi, I should just, in the efforts of full disclosure, I should tell you, Teresa's also a recovering lawyer. She went to law school and now still sort of doesn't practice law, but works on the advocacy side in New York.
The idea of you going and becoming an in-house counsel from that vantage point, even I know that sounds crazy.
I was like anything but 6-minute increments.
Oh, no.
Well, I don't know if I ever expected it to be what it is now, right? Of course, that never, as you've gathered so far, I didn't expect much of what happened. But what happened is, I think, partly that I got in early, right? There was no glut of travel blogs like there are now. There was no like travel blogging school or anything, and I didn't even know I had a travel blog. I just started writing for my mom and my clients. My clients still read, like they send me photos of their tomato gardens and stuff. They're adorable. My clients from the firm I worked at before I quit. And people just seem to like the long form writing. And for me, it was just, I would write if no one was reading. I'll write in the ways that I want to read. And that's been my litmus for the site. That's why I never took ads. That's why there's no pop-ups. And that's why I don't take sponsored content. It was like, what do I as a reader want to see? That's what I want to mirror in my own work. And I think the combination of sort of first mover advantage, a writing style that people seem to like, which I'm honored by, and this community that slowly built, opportunities to make money came to me as I was continuing with travel. And it finally got to a point where I was like, maybe I'll just see, I'm going to set like this date as a limit to, if I'm not making enough to save as opposed, or break even at least, then I'll go back to New York. And if so, then I'll just see where it goes. And that's basically what happened.
That's great. And we definitely want to get more into that. And we're going to ask you some more questions about your business and how that's worked for you. Before we get too far, I wanted to go back to what you said about fear, because it's so personal and interesting to your journey. You said something like, you've always been an anxious person and fear has been an undercurrent, and yet you've made these choices that seem to be courageous and interesting, and because you felt a challenge and so you went. Can you talk about, some people are, I think, caged their whole lives by fear, and I can think personally in the legal field and otherwise of many people who are very unhappy but are afraid to leave. Can you talk a little bit more about what you meant about that and what it's like to be an anxious person who makes these bold choices and how that's worked for you?
Sure. I think when you talk about fear, it's deeply personal, right? It viscerally comes out in you in ways that are different than other people, and everyone's anxiety looks like a different prison. So for me personally, the idea of leaving the law was terrifying insofar as I didn't know where my money would come from. I didn't know what I would do next. There were a lot of specific things, but I had not felt like my identity was tied to being a lawyer in the way that I think a lot of people speak of it. And that's probably because I went to law school on a bet.
Right.
I think I wasn't deeply twinned with me, Jodi as lawyer versus Jodi as whatever. I never saw myself as a writer either, but, it was just something that I thought, well, I always write for myself. And if my mom wants to read it from afar, that progressed too. The fear aspect for me, I think, comes in on a day-to-day basis. I am more conservative in some of the places I'll visit as a woman alone. There are a lot more, I'm not as adventurous, how's that, as a lot of the women I know who don't suffer from anxiety. And I think being a lawyer, I was talking about this with a friend today, actually, about how, being anxious already, I think being trained like so young in thinking like a lawyer and then working, my adult life right away as a lawyer, you're basically paid to sweat the small stuff. And it creates these like neural pathways of catastrophic thinking that are a terrible habit to get. I feel like all I've done in the rest of my life is try and undo that to varying degrees of success. I still find myself sometimes paralyzed by it. And there are certainly, like, no matter what new country I'm going to, even if I've traveled for as long as I have, I can't sleep and I'm nauseous, these are things that I think don't go away. All you can do is just get a bit more zen, this is what I'm feeling. This is how it is. It doesn't define everything about me. It just defines this moment. And for me, I've found respite in, Vipassana meditation. I did a 10-day Vipassana course a few years ago. I've written about that as well. I'm certainly not a guru by any shape or form. And, we're all flawed, but I'm not making that a part of my career. It was a very deeply personal tool that helped like wedge some space between the anxiety and me. And I think the difference I see in some of the readers who write or the lawyers who write me in fear of leaving is partly that I was young enough that I hadn't a mortgage and a family and a deeply, ensconced life that would create a much bigger obstacle to leaving. And part of it is also that I think I never saw my life as being one thing. And I was brought up in a family that really focused on story. My mom, studied history and would tell us at the dinner table these like amazing stories about, King Henry. She would just make it so interesting that I was brought up truly to focus on all the little details as being the building blocks of life, and that you can sort of weave together this tapestry of what life means to you from all these disparate nodes that maybe other people don't weave together. Like that's your thing. So I think it goes to identity more than anything. That fear for me, it came down to like the things I worried about myself, like getting really sick, getting hurt, something, getting, sexually assaulted, the very personal things that happened to me. But from an identity perspective, those were less of an issue because I felt like I have this skill set, I'm able to put those skills to use somehow. Somehow I got through law school. Basically not out of my teens. Like I can figure that part out. And I think that confidence is what allowed me to do it.
And have there been any travels or trips that you were maybe particularly more anxious than usual about that turned out to be very different than what you may have projected beforehand?
I think that's everything with anxiety, right? Like that's why it's so useless, because served you something as a 4-year-old perhaps, but now as an adult, it's a useless tool because it doesn't actually ever manifest the way you worry. And so for me, like the things I was really worried about often didn't happen. And then, a guy tried to get in my room and kill me in a place in New Zealand. Like that, it's never what you expect, and the brain is a powerful thing, but it's really hard to undo that kind of whatever coping mechanism you created as a kid to start that line of anxiety.
Right.
The places I worried about traveling by myself originally often turned out completely fine. And, I took my mom to India for her 65th, which was itself like a very, very interesting. She doesn't travel the way I do.
Right.
I was like constantly like, no, you can't walk into cows. Like, please pay attention. But it was magical and exhausting. And the things I worried about, like us getting her sick. I was so worried about her getting sick from street food because, of course, her friends were like, just eat at hotels and you'll be fine. She was like, have you met my daughter? We're not doing that. And it turned out fine. Like that trip there was nothing there that I worried about that happened,
I know you talked about some fear around how are you going to make money, but you also talked about how the business really organically evolved. And at the end of that first year, you still had money left, you'd over budgeted, and you kept going. Like, how did it turn? I guess walk us through a little more about how you turned to continue going on that journey and how it turned into a business.
Sure. I mean, I should add that I think any entrepreneur is worried about money no matter what. Like I'm still worried, like what's gonna happen? People are like, it's doing well, right? And I was like, is it really doing well? What's well? Define it.
Of course you want to define it too because you're a lawyer. I understand.
I feel like a brain. I think so. A few things. First of all, I guess I never thought my money would come from words, but I mean, it's fair that they did as a lawyer too. What happened first is I was asked by CNN in Asia to be a stringer for them and be on sort of their roster of writers that would be freelance. And I was like, people want to pay me to write? What? This is crazy. And it sort of led to other freelancing opportunities. The public speaking side of my business, I threw up for the first year before I got on stage to talk. Like I won most easily embarrassed in high school. My mom just found my old yearbook, confirmed. I did actually win most easily embarrassed. Like the thought that my parents still are like, I cannot believe that you do this, that you get on stage. But it was one of those things where Chris Gillibo said to me, can you help me with my conference? I'd met him in Asia at one of his meetups. A friend like dragged me kicking and screaming. I was like, I don't want to meet people. It from Myanmar, and I was in this like, at the time Myanmar was super closed, right? There were no SIM cards, there was no Wi-Fi. I was basically like traveling by myself by train and exhausted, and it was amazing and intense, but it was, you felt like you lived these really concentrated days because of how how closed the country was. And I got back to Bangkok and I was really kind of arrested by all these tall buildings and stuff.
Yeah.
Super grumpy. And my friend brought me to this conference and he's like, can you help me with my first World Domination Summit conference? And I said, sure, whatever you need, Chris. And he put me as a keynote speaker without asking.
Oh.
My friends were like, Jodi, like, you didn't tell us about this. And I was like, what? And I emailed him and I was like, Chris, there was some swearing. And he was like, listen, real talk, you wouldn't have said yes if I'd asked you. And now people want you to do it, so you shouldn't disappoint them. But, I credit him for that to start this aspect of my career I never expected. And I see public speaking the same way I see writing, which is that it's just a way to encourage people to learn about something in a different medium. Mm-hmm. And I'm honored by the people who seem to enjoy it, the speaking I do. I talk a lot about the neuroscience of storytelling. And, I think that, again, is this organic thing that came out of an opportunity. And I was like, I'm going to speak at conferences for a year and see if I get less nervous. I'm actually going to write a post this year about how I conquered that fear, because I think a lot of people are obviously terrified of public. And the other things, really, I credit my readers to all the other business parts of this moving legal nomads behemoth that it's become, because they'll say things like, hey, can we pay you to feed us when we visit you somewhere? And have food walks. And they'll say, I really would love you to help me navigate traveling as a celiac. Like, is there a translation card that you use? And I was like, yeah, I do have one for me. Maybe I'll sell them. I think this all kind of came out. The maps were, I just wanted to buy one for a friend. And I wanted a typographic map of food for Vietnam, and it didn't exist. And so I was like, I should build it.
And what was your first product?
I wrote the Food Traveler's Handbook before I did any of the existing products. Mm-hmm. And then the first the maps was Vietnam. I'm going to be doing 10 in all. And readers actually vote for the next country. So they've very aggressively asked for Japan for the next one.
Wow, cool.
All right.
I'm working on that right now. And I'll be doing, I think we're at 5 now, so I'll be doing 10 in all.
And just for my own personal reference, when was the first World Domination Summit? What year was that?
I believe it was 2011.
2011. Yeah, he's been doing it. Rich Earl's speaking at this year's. Oh, okay. We're fans of Rich Earl. I'm just looking at Teresa. And so, my hunch is that there are a lot of people out there who are good writers and who have something to offer. Talk about, if you would, about how blogging and writing, what is the magic elixir, I guess, to creating an audience, connecting with people, using articles that way, maybe even harken back a little bit to some early connections that your early writings led you to? Because one thing we like to think about is, there's people listening to this and who are sitting at desks unhappy at their jobs or whatever they're doing, and yet they have something that they can offer. Maybe there's a way to think about that leads them into some new direction. And my hunch is blogging seems so simple. You're writing, you're sharing ideas, you're producing content and sharing value. Why don't you share a little bit about your early experiences as a blogger and ways that's kind of expanded your world in such a surprising manner?
Sure. I think blogging being so easy is part of why it's difficult to be successful, because, the fire hose of the internet means that there's this cacophony of voices, and it makes it very difficult to stand out. As I said, I think part of my success came from coming in early, and partly because I did it a little differently. I think the struggle when you're building anything is that it's hard to know what advice to listen to. Mm-hmm. Everyone was telling me for the first many years, your posts are too long. No one wants to read that. And now people encourage long form writing. What litmus test, like I said, I always stick to, and I think everyone should, is they need to be able to put out content that jives with their own values. Mm-hmm. And that won't necessarily make them the richest person alive. Like, you can build a lowest common denominator site, right? But personally, my value structure includes me wanting to stand by the work that I do, I realized early that while I had a lot of friends who were building products and companies that they were like spinning off or selling and didn't really feel, deeply tied to the content itself, it was the idea. That's a different way of building a business, right? And for me personally, because it was tied to my name, it came down to my reputation. So I cared about quality writing and continuously, tried to improve my writing. You talk about skills, and be it writing or anything else, when people ask me about building a lifestyle, either location independent one or otherwise something that is entrepreneurial, if you don't like writing, do not be a writer. People like, I hate writing, but like, how do I write better? I hate writing, but what can I do for my blog? I was like, don't write a blog.
Right.
It's going to show eventually, right? I love to write. And as I said, I'd be writing for myself, even if there was no one paying attention. I think you have to pick that sweet spot between, it doesn't have to be your passion. I'm big on the Cal Newport style of, if everyone was, following their passion, and all of my compatriots in Canada would be like majoring in hockey in university. That's not how it works functionally. If you get really good at something, there's a pride there that carries you further in terms of your ability to keep doing it. But I do think it's important to set out the skills that you have when you're trying to figure this out, and then supplement that with courses to try and make them better. So for people sitting at their desks and looking at what they can do, taking in mind, of course, everyone's fact pattern is different, but, in terms of what obligations they have in their current life, setting up something as a hobby and trying to just get better at it is the first step in anything, because I had those initial years to hone my skills, to get better at photography, to get better at writing, before people were really paying attention. And I had the benefit of having saved up as a lawyer. So in that case, I wasn't needing to work like right then. But there's no way that I would be able to have built the site in the way that has been built if I didn't care about the bottom skill underlying it all, which is the words that I use.
Right. And were there any kind of early connections you made, or was there a moment when people really when you noticed that people were really starting to read the content? I mean, I imagine maybe when you began, you might have been sharing it with friends or family and maybe other platforms at the time, but was there something that happened that suddenly, wow, I've got all these people reading my blog posts?
My little brother was like traveling in, I think in Estonia. He like basically saved my site as the homepage for every hostel he stayed at. I was like, please.
That's awesome.
Oh, man, that's great.
He's like, just doing my part, Jodi. He's great.
Sweet.
I'm trying to think. I mean, 2000, I think when I started, a few things happened. One is that I lived in Bangkok for a while and I met a lot of journalists there, and it was really fascinating to hear their stories about how they built their own careers. They were like hard news journalists for the most part, and there to cover the political situation. But I think that's part of what steered me in the direction of writing about the things that were hopefully going to teach someone something new. There's nothing hard news about my site, but to try and talk about the history of the food, not just share photos of it, for example. I think people started to read around 2010, and when I met journalists there and in New York via Twitter for the most part. I joined Twitter because a friend of mine, I used to send out a newsletter as a lawyer called Linkies of the Day. And it was just like random political technology, like astronomy articles that I had found while reading. And it had a pretty decent sized list when I left. I wasn't trying to build a list. It was just like whatever. And so I joined Twitter because they were like, you should just share those things in real time. And I ended up doing that. And everyone else was like, why aren't you following more travel bloggers? Why aren't you tweeting more about travel? And I was like, I'm not a one-trick pony. Shared stuff that was interesting. And a lot of the people that followed me, and I followed as well. Like, I don't follow that many people on Twitter still, but we're a lot of journalists. And so when I would visit New York every summer, which I did, I would often meet them in person before Twitter sort of devolved into what it is now. And I think some press pieces were written at that time that helped push the site into more notoriety. So there was a New York Times profile in 2012, and a bunch of little things like that just slowly built it up into what it is.
You mentioned Japan and how your readers vote on where you're going to focus next in terms of your food maps. We have to ask, where have you been since you I know you can't mention every place, but give us a flavor, I guess, like a flavor of what that's looked like since you left your job.
If you go to the site, there is a drop-down menu on the bottom of all the countries. I spent a good amount of that time in Southeast Asia, several winters in a row in Vietnam because I was obsessed with the food, several winters in a row in Thailand for the same reason. And I traveled throughout, the Philippines, Indonesia, a lot of Southeast Asia. I started the trip in South America, so I spent several months running around there. I have not spent any time in Central America, with the exception of Belize, which kind of straddles the two. And I have not spent much time at all in Africa, which I would love to get to. And I think I spent a total of 6 months or 4 months in New Zealand, which was beautiful. I think what's been super interesting has been to see how wonderfully engaged the readers I have are. And I guess if you're going to sit through 10,000 words about the history of chili peppers, maybe you really care about food. But they send me these emails that are like, Jodi, I ate this today and thought of you, and it's just like a bowl of soup. That's the whole email. And I love it. They're like, I ate these tamales. Now that you're in Oaxaca, I'm sending you Mexican food. And it's just delightful. They're all delightful. And they've come on my food walks, because I started doing them in Saigon when they said, can we just pay you to feed us? And I was like, really? Okay, sure. And I started doing Oaxaca as well. I didn't expect to, but again, I got enough requests. And I've had about 20 people so far since January. And they're just so much fun because they're all people that if I met at a party, I would be like, let's chat. You seem really interesting. Like, let's be friends. And it confirms sort of the way that I'm writing, right? If I'm writing and I'm bringing in people that I click with, then I'm doing something right.
Right. And so in terms of like choosing where to go and how you kind of move about, are there any kind of principles or ways that you think about travel that lead you from one place to the next? Is it food or is it something else?
No. 100% food. I went to a wedding back in New York a few years ago, and they were like, oh, are you still at the same firm? And I was like, no.
Definitely not.
He was like, what do you do? And I was like, I eat soup for a living. And he was like, come on.
Love it.
I don't know what else to say. I was like, I do a lot of different weird things. I think that 99% of everything I think about in terms of travel has been food for the last many years. And, when I'm like eating lunch and thinking about with friends, like we're eating, what about dinner? Do you want to cook? Like I can't, I'm always thinking about food. My dad came to visit here recently in Oaxaca, and he was just like, man, you eat a lot. But I eat every 2 hours. Like I graze the way a cow does. So I'll eat a taco. And then 2 hours later, I want another taco. That's like the best life. What's wrong with that?
Right. And Oaxaca has incredible food.
It really does. Yeah. It really, really does. It's I chose it because friends for years were like, you need to go. If you're going to leave Asia and come to Central or South America, Oaxaca is the epicenter of super traditional Mexican food, and corn was domesticated in Yagul, which is right near the Oaxaca Valley. There's so much culinary history here. It's fascinating. Monte Alban, which is this Zapotec ruins that are just above the city. That was a city of 18,000 people when it was in its heyday, and it's so interesting to live here because it's mostly heritage corn they're using. They have like protests about GMOs often, and say what you will about GMOs. The point is not that, it's more that there's a lot of pride in the food and the base ingredients that make the food super interesting, to see how history has taken the foods that were originally here, like squash and turkeys and the moles that are known in the city and brought them around.
Tell us a little bit. I know you said very clearly that you grew up not caring about food and that was that really wasn't a part of your youth, and that absolutely has changed organically, it seems, as a part of this. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because now you said 100% food guides your choice of where to go. How did that happen?
I don't know. My friend, I do know. It's because I started traveling and I discovered how tasty things could be. I think I just never really, my years in New York as a lawyer, I definitely got very excited about the foods I was trying. When I started, there's a post on my site about condiments and spices, and I talked about being diagnosed as celiac and then kind of concurrently learning about spices from a guy who sold them at the market where I was living in the south of France. I was studying there for a year. And he would be like, I basically told him, I'll speak English and teach you some English if you teach me about spices. And he was like, sold. And he was like, okay, this is, cumin. It goes well with coriander. It also goes well with, it was very intuitive knowledge, and being gifted back this idea that spices could take what I thought was taken away from me, which was that a lot of the foods I loved and grew up with were off limits now. Mm-hmm. Giving it back to me in this new reframed way, that it was an egg can be more than 1,000 things, just because you add different spices, brought joy to me in a way that, I just felt was different than anything I'd experienced. And it started me on that path. And that was like around 2002. To think about food differently. And by the time I quit my job in 2008, I had experimented more in New York about food. I definitely am guilty of not having taken the disease seriously. Like, I did eat a lot of wheat in New York. I got sicker and sicker to the point where they were like, you are going to die. And, there's a correlation between stomach cancer and colon cancer and celiac for a reason. And I was scared enough to be super strict, but for years, I went on the really strict gluten-free diet, and then I slowly started eating it again, and was like, oh, I seem to be fine, until my intestines were, sufficiently damaged that I had to start all over again. And now it's been many, many years that I am very, very strict about it, and that same idea that, spices or herbs or things that I couldn't see or have access to, growing up, because it just wasn't part of my family's history, changed completely the way that I was able to learn about a place. In Vietnam, they don't say someone has a good soul. The translation is he has a good stomach. Mm-hmm. And that really epitomized for me what food gifted back to me, which was a way to connect to people, a way to learn as much as possible. And when I think of the lifestyle I've built and the life I've built, I get sick a lot because my immune system isn't the greatest, and there are, everyone's got their stuff. But I think the ability to learn as much as I can on a day-to-day basis and sort of indulge in this curiosity and make a living off of it is just an amazing thing that I'm honored by.
When you were talking about the spices, I was thinking Stephen and I have become really interested in personally and through this work about how disconnected from nature many of us are, from where our food comes, certainly, from where our food comes from, certainly. And I just was wondering, as you were talking about that, and you're starting to get into it, I think, about maybe what you've discovered along the way, if your work and your travels have brought you closer to nature or brought you closer to an experience of your authentic self, because that's something we are certainly interested in when we're talking about, breaking the normal path.
Sure. I think that's a very interesting question, because I feel like I did for a long time, and then I've tipped back into the other way, or the pendulum has shifted, because when you do for a living what most people do for vacation, mm-hmm. it's kind of hard to, like, what do you do then for your downtime? What right. You have to rethink that. And for me, it used to be like getting out and doing hiking and all these things, but I've dealt with chronic pain for a few years now, and I wrote about it, talking about like this. I had like an if this then that table for myself, where it was like, well, if I can't do this, what can I do instead? And it's sort of hard to find that joy again, when you're dealing with something that's chronic. I think going into nature and taking the time to disconnect and just sit and observe and feel is something that's really, really important, that all of us, even if we do something unconventional, are super susceptible to losing track of, just by virtue of the technology that we have in our lives.
Well, you've hinted at this a few times in your really very eloquent answers, but if there's one theme, it seems to me, about your business and your travels, is that you're kind of following your tastes or your interests. You're just kind of following something interesting to you, and that's pretty unique. I think many people would be hard pressed to say they do that. I'm curious if there are beliefs, or maybe one belief that kind of underpin that provide that kind of adventurous spirit to predominate in your life. Some kind of point of view or a value that you may have that helps give that the space to breathe that it seems to have.
I think it would come down to curiosity, to be honest. Family members often were like, "Jodi, curiosity killed the cat." It's the refrain. I think I always want to know why, and I thrive with people who are similarly minded, because life's just so much more interesting when you're learning or trying to understand. And, I think coming from the legal background, that can be a detriment sometimes. Like sometimes you just let it go, That's what I have to work on. That's the flip side to it. But I think that's what drives most of what I do. It's a very decadent thing, in a way, to be able to make a living off something that you enjoy. And I wouldn't say that it's like food isn't my passion. Mm-hmm. It's more that learning is my passion, and the lens that I've chosen to learn through is food. Mm-hmm. So if anything, it's probably curiosity that has been the sort of impetus for why I have sort of edged myself forward in these different ways. And that I think I've always been curious, but I definitely come from a family that emphasized learning both from books and by doing. And if you don't know the answer, then, find out, or don't be ashamed not to know. There's nothing wrong with not knowing. Right. That you have to think of that knowledge as just something interesting that you could do. I think that in connecting through food, it's taught me so much about people, and the ability that, despite coming from super different backgrounds and very disparate places, humans are humans all over the world. And I really wish that kids were forced in high school to go out and visit a developing country, and open their minds to the commonality, instead of focusing on how we started this podcast, which is, there's a lot of people afraid of going to Mexico. Right. There are bad and good people everywhere, of course. But the biggest gift that this lifestyle has given me is just this ability to learn from all these people that I've crossed paths with around the world who are so different to me.
Mm-hmm. One quick follow-up on that. What is it that you think gives... if you're in a place of that entrepreneurial place that you described, which I'm familiar with too, of a little financial anxiety, what enables you to keep going? What enables that curiosity to override that, or at least stay neck and neck with that if they're racing down the track, so that you don't sort of throw it all in and head to Cleary Gottlieb? Basically.
Nicely done. There are definitely days where I call a friend and I'm like, talk me off the ledge. Right. Say that so two things. One is I've maintained my bar admission in New York State, partly because there's no way I want to take the bar exam again, and partly because it's a worst case scenario that isn't the worst case, right? Yes, would it bring me the kind of joy that this life has brought me? No, but it is the fact that I have that, and as a skill set that I've, earned and built, is comforting and a security blanket in its own way. I think also it comes down to understanding what your other skills are that gives you the confidence to know, and I do need to be reminded of it sometimes. I think we all do. that if this doesn't work out, there are ways for me to earn a living that use all the things I've learned in the past 9 years. But, that nausea creeps in sometimes, for sure. I think financial anxiety is a good way of saying it. And it's certainly, anyone taking entrepreneurial risks, be they by themselves or, building a more scalable business, has to contend with it. But the base skills that you use and put together are things that no one can take from you. The site is an asset. If I pivot from it, the photography skills I have, the ability to write, all those things exist separate from what I've built.
So it sounds very logical, actually, which I think is really strong, because I think one thing, we've talked to a number of people, and in many cases people are they're because they think about it, they can see that, wait a second, I have way more than just the option of heading to Cleary Gottlieb. There's actually a dozen or more things I could also do. My options are not, as the fear might tell me, just this one other, frankly, awful scenario. So it sounds very thoughtful and logical, which rings really true.
I think it's hard to be that way, right?
Yeah, it is.
I fight the emotional side for sure. I mean, we all do in one degree or another, unless we're sociopaths. I think it's hard to have faith in yourself, especially when the internet just shows us how awesome other people are all the time.
Right.
But all you can do is put your head down and try and do better work.
Well, we have to wrap up. We know you have to scoot off to dinner. And so we have 3 final kind of questions we always ask everybody, just as a way to create a little consistency in our format. So, Tricia, you want to start?
Sure. So the first one is, what book or books, up to 3, would you recommend that every human being reads?
Well, start with A Short History of Nearly Everything by Bill Bryson, because it is an excellent overview of everything. I really think Difficult Conversations is an extremely important book.
Wow, you're the second person who's recommended that. That's pretty interesting, yeah.
Was Tynan the other one?
Yes.
He was!
Yeah. I took a repositioning cruise with him, with a bunch of 10 of us went. It was actually
oh my God, how cool.
And we were both like, no, everyone needs to read this book. It's amazing, and I think it's really important because, to your point about emotion versus logic, reactivity in conversation is something we're all programmed with, right? And being able to have the tool to diffuse things and try and have an honest conversation about really important things is something that comes in handy in every aspect of your life. I think it's important. I think for today's world, the other book I would recommend is The Antidote. I think the subhead is Happiness for People Who Hate Positive Thinking. I definitely am not the most woo-woo of humans. I have a very low woo-woo meter. And it's a British guy, and it's hilarious, but it's basically forcing yourself to be positive all the time actually does the opposite often. People just become fixated on how they're not positive enough. And it sort of dovetails nicely with the lectures that were part of the Vipassana course I did in terms of impermanence and just sort of letting go of the need for control, which is obviously something that I think a lot of people struggle with. I found it a very interesting book, not an obsessive self-help book, just really well written and sort of similar in a very different style to Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, and just in terms of stepping away, seeing the forest through the trees.
Right. Yeah, I've definitely done my share of beating myself up for not being positive enough.
I think we all do.
But I beat myself up in a very positive way. Teresa can vouch.
Compassionate beating.
Yes, right. Yeah. So this one's right in your wheelhouse. What's the best meal you've ever had?
Oh God, I can't.
And if you need to give a short list, that's okay.
I'll get back to you in a week.
Right.
Best meal. Oh man. There's so many, guys. There are so many. I don't think I can pinpoint one. I think that of all the types of food I love to eat, I appreciate street food more than, fancy restaurants, just because the experience the eating is part of the experience. It's not just about the taste. I think one of the best meals I ever had was a chicken rice noodle soup in Laos because I had had food poisoning for like 3 days from eating a yogurt that was not off its due date, just off anyhow. And the soup tasted better than I think. I was like, yes. I think on the list of best meals, a lot of them involve soups in Vietnam that I just fundamentally dream of all the time.
Oh, wow, that's cool.
That sounds good. The last question is, what have you learned in the last 30 days that you think every person should know?
Oh, wow, that's a tough one. I think it's important to know that your eardrum is sealed. And when you put drops in your ear, it doesn't actually sink in. It just sits there and blocks your ear. I learned this week. No, that's not what my answer would be. But I did learn that this week. I was like, my ear.
I've wondered about that myself.
I've been having some ear problems here. The dust, it's so dusty and it's a desert city.
Oh, yeah.
My sinuses are hating me at the moment. What have I learned in the last 30 days that I think everyone should know? I think one of the most important conversations I've had someone recently was along the lines of difficult conversations and just trying to understand the way that different people's minds work. And I think it's very common knowledge that we're all different, but when you sit down and actually stop yourself from being reactive in like a high tension situation, the most important thing you can do for your personal relationships, friendships or otherwise, is, to take those extra sections before you react. And a friend of mine talked about her technique for doing that. And it was specifically just to hold her breath when she felt the feeling rising up in her of like needing to just blurt something out super destructive, as she just inhaled deeply and held her breath for 5 seconds. And the combination of a little dizziness with that extra time, she said, has probably saved a lot of her relationships. And that was something I thought I was going to keep in mind going forward in
That's
life.
Useful, yeah. Well, there's plenty of little rabbit holes sitting there. We should just avoid those and kind of give you a chance to talk a little bit at the end here about maybe what's coming up for you and ways that people can connect with you, social media, website, etc. We'll put all of this in the show notes and we'll certainly link to it, but maybe you want to speak now about ways that you like ways you like to connect with others online.
Sure. My site is legalnomads with an s.com, and I'm Legal Nomads on Twitter and Instagram as well. I use Instagram quite a bit as I'm traveling and have enjoyed the stories as well. Business-wise, I'm going to be focusing on those additional food maps. I've got a guide to Oaxaca City and some stories about the vendors here. I'm going to be telling the stories of some of the vendors that I love going to and what their life story is. And those gluten-free guides with the cards that I'm selling have started. I've got a few countries now, and I'll be doing several more. And the most exciting thing, I think, for me in terms of what's up is that I'm going to be offering a writing course to readers, which, again, is something they asked for. And it's basically a nuts and bolts of storytelling in a digital world. And I'll be taking 10 people per class, so it's going to be very small. And every week there'll be an assignment that I'll edit personally. I'm just excited to work with some of my readers to help them be better storytellers.
Wow, that's cool.
That sounds awesome.
When does that take place, or do you have a date yet?
I don't. I just mentioned it in one newsletter, and then now I have like it's like, oh no. I'm writing the workbook for it. I have an outline done, and I have just a folder in my Gmail of people who are interested that I'll send an email to when it's ready to go. I'll send you a link to the landing page of just the brief info, but I'll put up a more detailed outline shortly.
Oh, that sounds so awesome, Jodi. Wow.
Yeah, I hope. I mean, I'm excited about it, and I also really love editing. And the work I've done in neuroscience of storytelling, it's so important to understand how story affects your brain to tell good stories, that it's hopefully, people enjoy the course, and I can do several classes of them each year. But it's an exciting thing for me too, because I've spent so many years learning about how to be better at writing, and it's really fun to be able to help teach.
Yeah, you lawyers are good writers. I don't know if there's any correlation there. Teresa's a really good writer, too. I hand her everything of mine to edit and make it sound good. Make it sound good. Well, thank you, Jodi. This has been wonderful. We're really grateful to you for your time, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to get a lot out of this.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jodi.
My pleasure.
All right, that's it for this week's Ownstream podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed our awesome conversation with Jodi Ettenberg. Be sure to check out the show notes for this episode for links to everything we mentioned, including Jodi's various products, definitely the food maps, which are really cool, all the books she talked about, her website, social media profiles, and her upcoming course on writing. All of that can be found at ownstream.co/Jodi. That's ownstream.co/JODI.
Also, before we let you go, please sign up for our weekly tip-off email at ownstream.co and just click the sign up button in the upper right-hand corner. This is where we share each Monday 3 cool things we've learned in the last week in the areas of lifestyle, business, and spirit. This could be an amazing quote, individual, tip, or tool designed to bring you more freedom and power in your life. So definitely sign up for that again at ownstream.co and just click sign up.
Finally, follow us on Twitter at Ownstream and on Instagram, where we post regularly at own_stream. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening to the Ownstream podcast. To learn more and connect with us, please visit ownstream.co or follow us on Twitter at Ownstream and Instagram at own_stream.